Let's look at final exam question number 93, found on page 680 of Teach Yourself Electricity and Electronics, 5th edition. The question asks us how we can find the peak output power of a pulsed laser based on the average power. Generally speaking, a pulsed laser produces very brief spikes of output power. That's this red waveform. The actual pulses in a real pulsed laser are much narrower than this, so the difference between the average power and the peak power is a lot greater than it is shown here. This is only for clarity that I've stretched the pulses out horizontally. If we assume that these pulses are rectangular, we can simplify the calculation, although we make it more approximate that way because oftentimes the pulses are not rectangular. This business is all discussed back on page 616, where you'll find a bunch of simple formulas for calculating the average power on the basis of the peak power or vice versa. But we need to know another quantity in order to find out the ratio between them, and that is the duty cycle. The duty cycle is simply the proportion of the time that the laser is actually operating. So if we have a peak output power of, symbolized like that, that is the peak output of the pulses, assuming that they are rectangular, then we can say that that is equal to the average output power divided by the duty cycle D as a proportion. Now the trick here is that this D is going to be a lot less than 1. So when we divide the average power by this quantity that's a lot less than 1, we're going to end up with a much larger number for the peak output power. But if we know that duty cycle as a proportion, now remember, if the duty cycle is expressed as a percentage, then in order to get the duty cycle as a proportion, we would have to divide by 100. So the duty cycle as a percent is 100 times the duty cycle as a proportion. You want to be sure when you divide in the previous formula that I showed you that you use the formula on the basis of a proportion, not as a percentage. So for example, if the duty cycle as a percentage is 1%, then the duty cycle as a proportion equals 0.01. You want to be sure that you do that. But this question really doesn't get into that kind of detail. It only asks you what you need to know besides the average power in order to calculate the peak power, and that is the duty cycle, which is represented by choice A, as in alpha.